Subcommittee meets this afternoon for our first hearing of the 116th Congress. Before we begin, I want to welcome our new ranking member, Senator Joe Manchin. I'd also like to welcome all of our former members back to the subcommittee and extend a special welcome to the new members joining us. On the majority side, we are joined by Senator Wicker, Senator Scott, Senator Blackburn. On the minority side, we are joined by Senator Heinrich. 2 years ago, this subcommittee was formed to address the most pressing national cybersecurity matters with a focus on DoD-related legislation and oversight. I look forward to legislation that builds on the hard work we have done over the past 2 years and continuing our important oversight of the plans, programs, and policies related to cyber forces and capabilities within the Department of Defense. Today, we will receive testimony on the Department of Defense enterprise-wide cybersecurity policies and architecture form. Mr. Dana Deasy, the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer, Vice Admiral Nancy Norton, the Director of the Defense Information Systems Agency and Commander of the Joint Force Headquarters, Department of Defense Information Network, and Brigadier General Dennis Crall, the Principal Deputy Cyber Advisor and Senior Military Advisor for Cyber Policy. We welcome you. We have a lot of information to cover, so I will be brief. At the conclusion of Ranking Member Manchin's comments, our witnesses will make their opening remarks. I would appreciate the witnesses limiting the remarks to about 5 minutes with the option of providing a longer statement for the record. After they finish their remarks, we will have a round of questions and answers. One of the Department's main cyberspace objectives articulated in the 2018 Department of Defense Cyber Strategy is securing DoD information and systems against malicious cyber activity. Unfortunately, in recent years, we have seen relentless and sophisticated cyber attacks on the DoD enterprise, other government agencies, and the private sector, while the capabilities of our adversaries continue to increase. Simply continuing to defend our networks as we have in the past is not adequate to counter the growing threats that we face. At a hearing with private sector witnesses last fall, we heard about the advances that industry has made in developing new tools and techniques for defending large enterprise networks. While there are many unique challenges because of the complexity and scope of the Department of Defense Information Network, also known as the DoD, it is important that where possible, we leverage the best practices from industry to defend our networks. In addition, it is equally imperative that the acquisition process of DoD is not precluding it from organically developing and producing state-of-the-art cybersecurity capabilities. In this context, we look forward today to learning more about JFHQ DoD and, in particular, how the organization can achieve a complete real-time picture of the entire DoD network. The Department's cybersecurity tools are not the only factor important to robust defense of the DoD. It is also critical that the Department formulate and implement appropriate cybersecurity policies and stand up a robust cybersecurity workforce. Specifically, we are looking forward to learning how the Department is implementing their 2018 cyber strategy in these areas of cybersecurity. Across the cybersecurity spectrum, it is vital that we are consistent in our approach as we further centralize, standardize, and integrate the complexities of DoD's cyber enterprise. We cannot afford to waste time or resources with the duplication of effort across the services, combatant commands, and support agencies. In that context, the witnesses here today are charged with these important tasks toward further streamlining and modernizing the Department's cyber defensive posture. We look forward to hearing how you are accomplishing this challenging task. Today's discussion builds on many of the themes that were discussed in our cybersecurity hearings with the private sector this past fall. While most of our subcommittee hearings are closed because they include classified information, I chose to hold an open hearing today so that private industry would have further insight into the Department's plans and future cybersecurity needs. I encourage DoD and private industry to continue a robust dialogue so that you can help each other to achieve overlapping goals and prepare for our upcoming cybersecurity hearings this year. Any questions that would require a classified answer can be submitted for the record, for which we would appreciate the Department's timely responses. Let me close by thanking our witnesses for appearing today and for their service to our nation. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you said, this is my first hearing as a ranking member of Cyber Subcommittee, and how it doves in well with my ranking on energy, which we have oversight of cyber also, so it's really going to be helpful. I'm delighted to be joining you, Senator Rounds. We've worked together as governors together, and now we're back together again as a partner to improve the cybersecurity of the Department of Defense, and indeed, I hope, the nation. I join you in welcoming our distinguished witnesses today. Chief Information Officer Dana Deasy. Am I correct on that? Okay. Defense Information System Agency Director Admiral Norton, and General Crall, who has the challenging task of overseeing on behalf of the Secretary of Defense the implementation of the Department's new cyber strategy. The committee has long looked for a way to empower DoD with the ability to adopt an effective strategy and plan of action to deter cyber attacks and defend against them. Thankfully, based on initial reviews of the new cyber strategy and the results of the new cyber posture review, there's optimism that DoD has turned a corner, that we now have a credible strategy and a commitment to implement it. The specifics of the new wide-ranging strategy are quite complicated, but I believe common sense can make this all understandable to our constituents back home. Here are some examples. I'm told we have not one network in DoD, but in fact, thousands. Each military service, defense agency, and every component within them have built their own networks with chaotic results. They can't work together effectively, and they are hard to defend. There is now a plan to break down these fractured networks and implement a common security architecture. We cannot allow a computer and other device to be connected to the network without verifying who installed it and whether it is correctly configured and protected. We have to be able to manage who accesses the network and what they can see and do. According to the role they are assigned, we have to monitor the activity that people and the computers they control are conducting on our network to guard against insider threats like Snowden. We have to improve the security of the networks of the companies that build weapons and provides services to DoD. We cannot allow China to keep stealing our technology and program plans through cyber attacks on the industrial base. We have to recruit, train, and retain real experts in cyber warfare despite fierce competition with the private sector and the hiring obstacles that the government faces. We have to figure out how to apply new artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies to detect cyber intrusions, as well as to help our cyber forces operate better and faster. These are the types of issues that the committee and DoD have talked about fixing for a long time, but now finally, the Department may be prepared to take real action. We hope so. So I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we look forward to y'all's testimony.
Thank you. And I would note also that former Governor Scott is here with us as well, so now you face questioning from three different governors from three different states as well. So I'm going to start things popping. And thanks, and Joe, we look forward to working with you on this project as well. We'll do the questioning in 5-minute cycles, and we'll just take our time and work our way through. We'll try to limit our questions to get specifics, and then we'll ask each of our members if we would try to limit them to 5 minutes, and we'll move back and forth. So as I said earlier, you are all welcome to provide a complete transcript or a record or a statement for the record, but we would appreciate it if you would also keep your opening statements to 5 minutes as well. And Mr. Deasy, I'll turn to you first if you'd like to begin, and then I'll let you decide how you would like to proceed from there.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify before the subcommittee today on the Department's cyber architectures and policies. I'm Dana Deasy, the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. With me today are Vice Admiral Nancy Norton, Director DISA and Commander JFHQ Doden, and Brigadier General Dennis Crall, Senior Military Advisor for Cyber Policy and Deputy Principal Cyber Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Since my arrival at the Department last May, I have made cybersecurity one of my top priorities. In September of 2018, the Department released a top-level DoD cyber strategy. The strategy represents the Department's vision for addressing cyber threats and implementing the cyber priorities of the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy. The Department also released its Cyber Posture Review to Congress, which provided a comprehensive review of the cyber posture for the DoD and identified gaps in our strategy, policy, and cyber capabilities. Also last year, the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary asked me to undertake a study to determine what the Department's cyber priorities should be. This led to the creation of the top 10 cyber priorities. Cyber roles and responsibilities are shared across the Department. Only by working together, as you will hear from the three of us today, we are able to close the gaps and secure our systems. For the first time under the authorities granted by Section 909 of FY18 NDAA, the DoD is reviewing, commenting on, and certifying all of the IT budgets, which includes cyber, across the Department. Additionally, the DoD CIO now has the authority to set and enforce IT standards across the Department. Together, DoD, CIO, DISA, and PCA work regularly to implement the DoD cyber strategies in close coordination with the military departments and other DoD components. DoD CIO and PCA co-lead a weekly meeting focused on cyber issues with the Deputy Secretary of Defense, at which all military departments and OSD principals are in attendance. A key element of the Department's approach to standardizing cyber security across the Department is setting the standards in the Cybersecurity Reference Architecture, which is a tool providing cyber guidance for the family of architectures that align to the DoD overall enterprise architecture. As we aggressively leverage automation, new endpoint security technologies, and standard architectures to achieve military advantage through information, having strong assurances of who is accessing the data and how they are accessing the data is critical. We have been actively deploying a DoD identity, credential, and access management strategy that recognizes the changing environment and addresses the increasing dependence on digital identities to share information rapidly and more securely. Turning to cyber workforce. As my deputy, Ms. S.C. Miller, testified before you last September, DoD recognizes the importance of growing and maintaining the cyber workforce. It's an imperative that DoD attract the next generation to view the Department as an employer with unique and challenging opportunities within the cybersecurity career field. Recent authorities provided by Congress have allowed the Department to adjust existing policies and to implement new policies that account for this dynamic need in an increasingly important mission area. One of these key authorities has been the establishment of the Cyber Accepted Service. In closing, the close working relationship between DoD CIO, DISA, and PCA is critical to our ability to address cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The importance of connection between policy, standard architectures, and remediation cannot be overstated. The Department has clearly defined cybersecurity problems to be solved, has a well-thought-out remediation approach, the right mechanisms are in place to monitor and report on our progress on the top 10 cyber priorities. I want to emphasize the importance of our partnership with Congress in all areas, but with particular focus on cybersecurity. Continued support for a flexible approach to cyber resourcing, budgeting, acquisition, and personnel will help enable success against an ever-changing dynamic cyber threat. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions. And with that, over to Admiral Norton.
Vice Admiral Norton, welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. As Mr. Deasy said, I'm Vice Admiral Nancy Norton, and I serve as the commander of the Joint Force Headquarters Doden, or JFHQ Doden, and the Defense Information Systems Network, the director of the Defense Information Systems Agency, also known as DISA. Thank you for your invitation to join Mr. Deasy and Brigadier General Crall here today as we discuss our cybersecurity efforts. The JFHQ Doden was created to globally integrate command and control for Doden operations and defensive cyberspace operations internal defensive measures, or DCO-IDM, across all 43 DoD components. As an operational component command under U.S. Cyber Command, JFHQ DODN provides unity of effort and unity of command across the DoD's layered defensive construct to protect DoD networks. JFHQ DODN exercises directive authority for cyberspace operations, or DACO, to establish a coordinated approach for implementing priority actions at all levels of cyber defense. In addition, we issue orders and directives to all DoD components that address threats and vulnerabilities to the DODN. Our daily interactions with all 43 DoD components involve sharing cybersecurity operations information and cyber intelligence, validating status of directed cyberspace actions, and updating defensive cyber priorities regarding unclassified and classified networks and cyber-enabled devices that are connected to the DODN. JFHQ DODN provides the operational requirements and expected outcomes aligned to the cyber strategy and the cyber top 10, which benefit from the standardization of capabilities across the cyber enterprise that is directed under the DoD CIO's authority. Additionally, JFHQ DODN conducts cyber readiness inspections, which require each network owner and their cybersecurity service providers to understand how their cyber readiness relates to their own mission and operational risks, and reviews their cyber compliance factors. DISA is a combat support agency that provides, operates, and assures command and control and information sharing capabilities in direct support of joint warfighters, national-level leaders, and other mission and coalition partners across the full spectrum of operations. Its primary purposes are to provide the information technology necessary for the DoD to protect our nation and to support the JFHQ DODN and U.S. Cyber Command in defense of ongoing cyber attacks, clearly critical to national security. DISA is a combined workforce of approximately 16,000 military, civilian, and contract employees. DISA is operating and evolving a global enterprise infrastructure based on common standards set by the DoD CIO, enabling effective, resilient, and interoperable solutions that support multi-domain warfare in the face of escalating cyber threats. DISA directs, coordinates, and synchronizes the DISA-managed portions of the DODN, supporting the DoD around the world, and supports U.S. Cyber Command in its mission to secure, operate, and defend the DODN. DISA's acquisition strategy works to provide efficient and compliant procurement services for information technology, telecommunications, and cybersecurity capabilities in defense of their nation. The agency relies on a robust partnership with industry to achieve its mission. Just as the military services look to industry to design, build, and field weapons and platforms based on stringent requirements, DISA looks to industry to design, build, and field cybersecurity tools that will meet our stringent requirements in the rapidly evolving cyber domain. DISA's trusted partnerships with industry are critical to bringing effective and secure capability to leaders and warfighters around the world. DISA routinely engages with industry to ensure they have a clear understanding of what the department needs are now and how we anticipate they will evolve in the future. Both DISA and Joint Force Headquarters DODN focus on one primary endeavor: to connect and protect our joint warfighters in cyberspace to increase lethality across all warfighting domains in defense of our nation. I thank you for this opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Admiral Norton. General Crall, you may begin.
Thank you, sir. I certainly appreciate, like the others, the opportunity to come before the subcommittee and share a few thoughts and ideas, answer your questions. But more importantly, I thank you for your genuine interest and help in this critical domain. It's made a difference. Just want to cover a couple items. If last year maybe the theme was on strategy, sir, and you've mentioned the fact that we finally published a cyber strategy complete with a posture review, we can take a look at some of those gaps that we have and get after them. I would say this year's moniker is a bit different. This is about implementation. We know where we need to head. We know the pacing that we have in front of us, but it's now time to show results. So I would say that this is the year of outcomes, and that's what we're focused on, is delivering the capabilities and improvements that we've discussed for some time. We have actionable lines of effort that come from our cyber strategy. These are things we can do and we can measure our progress against, and that's what we're focused on. So while it's a good year for implementation, I would say it may not be a good year for some items, and let me just share with you a couple of those. The first is stovepipe solutions. It's a bad year for those who like to approach this in a way that we have endless niche capabilities that those run off and do business their own way. Lack of standards, individual development, and difficulty in integrating. We're putting an end to that practice, which has really robbed us of success. It's also a bad year for those who don't like measures of effectiveness or discussions in data-driven return of investments. We owe an accountability for how we've spent our money and also a level of accountability on what capabilities we've achieved in the expenditure of that money and effort. And lastly, I would say it's a bad year for those who like endless pilots, pathfinders, and experiments that lead to nowhere. This is about getting to results, experimenting quickly, informing the learning that we get from those, and putting that back into implementation. So I do agree that there's a sense of optimism. I think the Department has turned a corner, but this is the year that we really have to show the results of that effort. And I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, General Crall. We've just been advised that we have votes at 3 o'clock, and so we will probably just keep the committee going, but we'll take turns leaving, going and getting the vote in, and then coming back in. So no disrespect meant, but we're going to be rotating in and out. To all witnesses, and this is a question that I guess I gave you all kind of a heads up on that I'm going to ask today. In a hearing with private industry on best cybersecurity practices, we heard from Dmitry Alprovich of CrowdStrike that they have a 1-10-60 challenge for responding to cyber intrusions. 1 minute to detect it, 10 minutes to understand it, and 1 hour to contain it. How well would DoD measure against these metrics, and are there any services or components that are better positioned to meet these goals? Mr. Deasy, I'll let you start, and you can pass it off if you'd like.
So this is clearly a operational question on how you handle a real-time event.
This is a metrics question.
Absolutely. So this is clearly best for Vice Admiral Norton to answer, since this is what she faces every day.
Yes, sir. So I appreciate that question, and definitely enjoyed the conversation that you had with industry and talking about that. That way of thinking about the challenge that we have, 1-10-60, was a good way of laying out what kinds of speed that we need in order to face cybersecurity threats. We have not in DoD laid out a similar kind of benchmark like the 1-10-60, but absolutely are looking at what are the requirements for detecting as rapidly as possible, responding as rapidly as possible, and how we can continuously increase that pace at the pace of cyber. So I would like to take that question off the record for specifics on the response, but very definitely understand that we are watching and building towards a timed pacing of our adversary like that, just without that 1-10-60 construct.
Okay, but I'm going to go one step farther, and this time I'm going to direct it to General Crall. Metrics are important. In this particular case, CrowdStrike, who is public, clearly can say in public that's their goal. Metrics like this, are these metrics that should be attainable, or are these metrics that an enterprise such as the DoD, is this something that they look at right now? Are there metrics out there that we're trying to achieve? Share with me your thoughts about the importance of this type of an approach.
Yes, sir. I think even in my opening, I talked about our ability to measure. So there's no doubt that we need metrics in place. I can't comment specifically to the 1-10-60, whether that's the right metric for every DoD domain. These domains are constructed quite differently, and even with some tactical edge considerations on how they operate, we take some unique risks at the tactical edge that we might not take in other aspects of our network. So those need to be tailored to the mission at hand. But I would say this, the right question is, for a closed session perhaps, is what are our metrics and how are we striving to achieve them? And in a closed session, I think we could talk about some of the first efforts that Mr. Deasy has laid that I'm helping institute as it comes to some detection, remediation efforts that would drive to that.
Thank you. Mr. Deasy, you have publicly announced that your 4 priorities are cloud, AI, cybersecurity, and C2. What progress have you made in modernizing the Department's cybersecurity, and Does your office have all of the resources it needs to execute these priorities?
So I would say that when I talk publicly about those 4 priorities, one of the things that I point out is how interlinked those are, meaning that if you're having a cloud conversation, cyber is the way we're going to institute cloud is very much going to help our cyber posture. It's going to help the way we build applications. It's going to help the way we house our data. When we think of AI is very much going to help the cyber agenda. Some of our early national mission initiatives are looking at how do we use AI, for example, to look at insider threat. How do we look for anomalies in our environment? And then finally, command control communications, the C3 side. We know that we have generations of communications equipment that was designed in what I'll call a pre-cyber era. So as we build the next generation of command control communications, we are building them first and foremost with what does it mean to have the right cyber in place. So I would say that as I go about discussing these priorities, we always say that cyber is at the heart of the digital modernization of the Department of Defense. Everything that we are baking in and building for the future is starting with the mindset of we must bake cyber in from the start.
Thank you. Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if I can, with Mr. Deasy, you have quite an impressive resume, basically in the private sector. Coming to the government sector, we appreciate you for your service, and seeing that basically over the years how we've been hacked and espionage has gone on, and the things that I mentioned as far as 1,000 different sites, if you will, and none of them seem to be talking to each other or protecting each other. Do you believe that we can rapidly close that gap and change our approach to how we do business?
It's an outstanding question and probably one of the top ones every day I address. And I think General Crall actually hit upon it. The days of people, what I like to refer to as rolling their own solutions, standing up unique systems to solve unique mission sets, has to be revisited. So one of the things, especially now given the new authorities that I have, is that we are putting out a tone that as we go through the remediation of our various cyber programs, the days of debating what's the various tools and software that we're going to use, we have to stop. We have to quickly move from the debate of what's the right source of the solution to the implementation approach. I've always said there's no reason we need different tools to solve for many of these problems. The way we will implement those tools are obviously going to be different if you're dealing with the tactical edge and advanced space versus if you're going to deal inside the Pentagon. But I have been very direct and quite vocal that we need to standardize more, we need to stop rolling individual solutions, and we need to move beyond the debates of what are the right product sets, and we need to spend all of our time talking about how to get the work done.
I wanted to ask you about your cyber top 10 to see where you're working. But first of all, on the different types of systems we have been using in different applications and the companies we have dealt with or contracted with. Speaking of Kaspersky, Huawei, have you gone through, have you all been able to see if we're still using those contractors or their equipment?
I would say that some of this discussion should probably be held in a classified session, but I can say generically that, yes, we are aware of the capability of those particular.
Let me just ask you, have you all evaluated?
We have evaluated.
Because I was on Intel, so I know where you're coming from, but have you all done the evaluation? We probably requested in Intel to tell us who is still using, and any departments are still using these components.
We have evaluated. Happy to share with you offline what the results of that are.
We'd love to see that.
And more importantly, share with you the approach we're using as we find additional vendors, how we deal with this.
Maybe, Chairman, I can get together with you all on that in a classified setting. How about your top 10 issues to characterize your priorities? Can you tell me where your items are, your top 10 list, and what's the relationship with the cyber strategy?
So the way that I describe the top 10 is we stepped back, because depending on who you went and talked to inside the department and said, what is a risk, you would get a very different answer. Because your commander, if you're talking to someone who's sitting at an endpoint, your desktop, or if you're out managing a weapons system. So we stepped back and said, if you think this through the eyes of an adversary and how they think of the world, how they would traverse the Department of Defense, we stepped back and we laid out a set of priorities to address all the points of interventions where we think adversaries would try to intersect with us. Obviously, it would not be prudent for me today to walk through each of those individual 10 things as one could draw conclusions from that. But suffice to say, we've taken a very holistic approach for the first time of how we think about all aspects of the chain of how data moves across the Department of Defense, and then what are those points that we need to put prioritization against.
And just, Admiral Norton, you're the director of the Defense Information System Agency, correct? But you're also dual-hatted as the commander of the Joint Force Headquarters for the DoD Information Network. For the totality of the DoD's networks, are all the cybersecurity service providers scattered across DoD, are they under your purview, your command?
They are not under my command, sir. They are under my directive authority for cyberspace operations. So the cybersecurity service providers, in some cases, work for me as DISA. In other cases, they work for the military.
How about the cyber protection teams?
The cyber protection teams are the same thing. I do have some. I have 6 of those that work for me specifically as the Joint Force Headquarters DODN, directly supporting the DODN backbone and the perimeter defenses. But others of the cyber protection teams are assigned to the services and some to each of the combatant commands as well. But all of those, both the security service providers and the cyber protection teams, as well as every system administrator, every one of the cyber workforce, is under my authority for directive authority for cyberspace operations, meaning I can synchronize the actions across all of the DoD of any responses that we need to take, any changes that we need to make on the network based on that DACO authority that I have under U.S. Cyber Command.
Well, I mean, your last response there, but basically how can you prevent through cyber the attacks that may be going on or could going on if you're not over total control? And basically, if your one directive goes across all of the different commands, if they're, well, I'm understanding at first they don't report directly to you, and they are in each of the commands have different chains?
Yes, sir. So
is that a disconnect there? Or we're not
I don't believe it is. JFHQ DODN was stood up specifically to do the synchronization and command and control of the defensive cyberspace operations forces across the DoD. So, it would be very difficult to aggregate them all into one command. There are about 250,000 cyber workforce across the DoD. They're as disparate as, serving in a squadron in the Air Force or a submarine in the Navy, every one of the agencies across the board. But with that directive authority for cyberspace operations, I'm able to mandate what kind of actions they're taking on a daily basis, and do that through a daily cyber tasking order that we have with all 43 components.
I think in a nutshell what I'm asking, how do we prevent a Snowden from continuing all the different breaks that the public knows about? There's more that they don't know about. The ones that have been very public. Have we taken steps in Mr. Deasy or General Crall? You've seen this through your career. Is the steps being taken to close that loophole so that doesn't repeat?
Yes, sir. We absolutely have. There are many, many actions that we've taken. Snowden, of course, was an insider threat, and we have taken specific actions addressing an insider threat across the department. There's always more to be done because that's a very complex problem, getting at that. But we absolutely have. And Joint Force Headquarters DODN has only been in existence for 4 years this week. So we are maturing in the ability to synchronize all of those efforts. We didn't have this when Snowden, Snowden was able to infiltrate and exfiltrate the data that he did.
I'm going to go vote, and I'll be right back.
Yes, sir.
And let me just continue on, because I think that's an important part of the reason why we do the open hearing now is to talk a little bit about how big this challenge is, because you're talking about not just all of the armed forces, but you're also talking about our acquisition processes. You're talking about a huge contractor base out there that is just as susceptible to cyber theft as our armed services are, and yet all of our air, land, and sea domains are at risk if our cyber domain is not secured, just like our space domain has to be secured. And I think that's part of the message we're trying to get here is this is not something that can be done simply by the Department of Defense alone. This is a case of where we have to have the rest of industry obviously in tune with us. Can you talk a little bit about the coordination which you're trying to do with those entities that are defense contractors and their subcontractors, how big this is, but also what you're doing to try to focus on that?
I'll be happy to address that. So it turns out on that top 10 priority list, one of those is the defense industrial base, or often referred to this as the supply chain. I mean, look, it's very, very clear that, and you're right, defending our networks extend all the way out to our contractor networks. You could argue they're just an extension of what we do. We pass classified data, they do things on behalf of us. So there's no doubt when you look at the first tier and the second tier and you think about exfiltrations and the problems that have occurred, we have to treat our subcontracting base the same way that we think about defending our own networks. Now, to that end, we get some help. There is standards that our defense contractors are obligated to follow. It's the NIST standard. It's the same one the Department of Defense follows. We have recently stood up, and you've probably heard the Deputy Secretary stood up a task force. I had made a recommendation that we need to look at holistically from the day we awarded a contract to the moment we have an exfil or a spill occurred, and how we then handle that needs to be rethought through. And so right now there is a task force that is stepping through the entire way that we handle our contractual relationships, our notification of problems, our forensics when we do have a problem, to improve upon that. One of the problems we see is this problem is not necessarily a Tier 1 supply level. It is, to your point, it's down really when you get to the Tier 3 and the Tier 4.
Explain what that is.
So in many cases, we will contract with a very large traditional defense, but they don't build everything for us. They don't engineer everything for us. They will go out and contract with a firm.
Which means they share classified information with their subcontractors, who may very well share that same classified information with a subset of contractors again.
And that entire chain is tracked. Where the issue breaks down is as you go down to those various subcontractors, do they understand, equipped, have the knowledge and the capability to defend themselves, and what is it that we should be doing more to help them learn how to defend themselves at those tiers?
Okay, it's not a new problem, but most certainly it's one that this is where we find a lot of our hygiene problems at, and that's the way most of our information is lost, is through improper cyber hygiene, meaning somebody at a level basically made a mistake and somebody got into their system and now has access. Can you talk a little bit about, it's one thing to make a law or a rule, it's another thing to be able to enforce it. Talk to me about your enforcement actions and how you see ways to not only make the law, but enforce the law, and then to follow up and audit the process. What do you have in place, and where are you short of capabilities today?
So, first of all, you make a very good point. If you look at a lot of the problems that have occurred and where the forensics been done, it does come back many times to basic hygienes. So we start with a self-certification process. We are now looking at a new process that ANS is leading, and that is how do we then build a confidence score against their self-certification? The acquisition.
Okay.
Folks, Ellen Lord's, Miss Lord's organization, where they go through and they evaluate that self-assessment, they put a confidence score against that, and then what they're now looking at is how do we go out and have a closed-loop system where we can go out and validate what it is that they self-assessed against. Now, of course, this is a massively large supply base, so there's discussions right now on what is the right approach on doing that, given that trying to get to every single member of that supply base might be overly challenged. And so how do you sample and how do you do this in a way where you can start to get confidence that as you move down those tiers, that there's self-certification.
Let me follow up, because I think that's a critical lead-in to another piece here, and as other members come back, we'll allow them to get into this as well, but I have to ask, even if you could hire, and I know that you need to hire more experts in cybersecurity, but you're also going to have to hire and contract out with entities that have real expertise in cybersecurity. Do you have a process in place to invite and vet expertise within cybersecurity that we can use to help us? And then once you get past that stage, you recognize that you can't do it with manpower alone. You're going to have the additional electronic resources, including AI. Can you work your way through that from looking outside of government, manpower needs, and then also moving to AI?
So, as you know, I do come from private industry, and this problem for large companies in private industry is no different, i.e. they don't have the capability to evaluate every one of their supply chain vendors. So what has happened in private industry, which is what we are now looking at for the DoD, is actually a process of identifying, possibly even certifying companies that can play the role, that can follow the NIST standard, and actually go in and look at a second, third-tier supplier.
Are you taking invitations for that now?
No, we are just in the early discussions of how we might do that. As I said, ANS is the lead for this. I've been advising them on how this has been done elsewhere. We haven't started, to your AI question, there is definitely going to be value in looking at how do you take the entire supply base, the NIST standards, the hygiene problems we see, and can you apply AI to this problem to start to identify where you may most likely are going to experience problems inside your supply chain. We are just literally just in discussions. I do not want to suggest that we have an active program underway, but I would suggest that this is a good case where we can apply machine learning to looking at this problem.
I will give Senator Scott an opportunity to get settled, but I'm just going to ask you one more question, then I'll move to Senator Scott. Right now, there really is a difference between AI and machine learning. Are you deeper in with machine learning right now to cover a lot of the items right now that otherwise we just don't have the manpower to cover? How far along are we?
We are still very much in the early days. I would actually be very happy to come and have a session with you on what is called the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center and how we're using that to apply new AI, machine learning algorithms to solve for some of these problems that I think you're touching upon here today. But probably best that I come and talk to you offline about how we're approaching the AI machine learning problem.
Very good, thank you. Senator Scott.
If I ask a question that somebody's already asked, we did go do a vote. How do you deal with you get a lot of wonderful vendors from all over the United States and around the world that want to sell you stuff. How do you all make a decision what you're going to buy and who's the best vendor?
So there's a number of us that can do that. Why don't we start with Vice Admiral Norton? You use a number of suppliers. How do you go through your vetting process?
Well, we have a lot of different mechanisms that we interact with industry, starting with very public and very open things like we have a forecast to industry where everybody is invited to come in and hear about what we're doing, what is already ongoing, what is planned in the near future, and then opportunities for each of those vendors to talk to the program managers and the leadership at DISA and get an understanding of what they might be interested in pursuing. We have a small business programs office that specifically targets and interacts directly with the small businesses that have interest in any of our activities. They feed back into different parts of DISA for further communications. So that gives us sort of the understanding with industry of what's available, and then from there it's evaluation based on the performance criteria that we've set for the particular product or particular capability that we need, and understanding what the acquisition strategy might be. In some cases, that means doing a major evaluation of a number of different contractors at companies that have similar products and evaluating them for the best fit. In some cases, it means something like another transaction authority where we have a couple of different prototypes, and both of them are able to build out and demonstrate, what capability would best suit the need that we have.
Sir, thank you. This really does come down, as Admiral Norton talked about, to requirements. That's both stated, what I need today and what I anticipate. Not just simply, as you know, sir, chasing after capability that I might not need or couldn't find a use for, which sometimes they come packaged. We do look at performance, and we look at performance in measures at that tactical edge, which is different. We found vendors in many cases that work very well in a flagpole or garrison environment, but when we start getting to thin line, red line, or austere conditions, the product may not perform as well, and that's a consideration for a warfighting machine that's expected to operate in an information-contested environment. So that's one area that we take a look at, and of course, no shortchanging the idea of cost. It's something that's sustainable or affordable. But the other piece that I think is important is how flexible it is, the thing that we're looking at. Requirements do change. And one of the big concerns is not getting locked into something that requires a level of emulation, patching, or really caretaking that could exceed the cost of the product to begin with. So really looking at more informative ways to do it. But the problem really isn't so much about us finding the right vendor that can provide what it is. It's the vendor's patience in dealing with us in our lack of flexibility and acquisition. We find more vendors that most likely will walk away from trying to deal with us because of simply the way that we contract. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't contract that way. There's reasons why we have some of the contracting rules and regulations to ensure that we behave properly. But, in industry, as Mr. Deasy will attest, his experience of finding a solution, matching a vendor with a need, can be done very quickly in the civilian world, where we might find ourselves years out by the time we compete properly, line up the resources, make sure it's within our POM cycle, and actually move on that. The product might not even be viable at the time of purchase.
So what needs to change?
Sir, I think we're doing the change on the front end is we are focused on requirements, so I think we're doing our part. We've had great relationship with the vendors. Industry is going to help us get through many of the problems we're talking about. They absolutely bring the technology we need to bear. But focusing on requirements, that's our responsibility. I think we've done a better job. The way we consume products, moving toward as a service model, vice having to own everything, is a methodology that we're looking at. And I think we need to be more thoughtful in how we come back to Congress and ask for some help on how we acquire. The acquisition machine, I believe, needs to change.
If you ask me, it's one word: speed. I think about how in the private industry, from the time that they identify that the adversary now has a new set of methodologies and tactics, your ability to go out and scan industry to see who is addressing that, quickly find those companies, bring them in, evaluate them, move through the procurement cycle, and get them operationally installed inside the environment has to be done with a lot more speed than we have today, sir.
Can I continue? So do you ever feel taken advantage of by a vendor that talks you into a type of an RFP, and then you find out at the end there are other vendors that you couldn't even do business with because of how you started, the RFP you started out with? And how do you deal with that, if that's true? I used to be an investor in internet security, and we did business with the government. And a lot of people talked about we won based on how well we did, helped with the RFP. Do you feel like that industry does that to you?
I have not seen that. What I have seen sometimes is a poor understanding of your requirements up front. And so you're misaligned because you haven't spent enough time really understanding what your requirements are. A vendor's in trying to then come in and sell you something that may or may not meet your requirements. And I see more of a disconnect between what the vendor is trying to tell you they have versus the requirements. And that needs to be, I think, properly vetted at the front end where better.
One of the things that DISA has done routinely is we put out RFIs, requests for information, in advance of an RFP broadly, and have an ongoing dialogue with industry so that we get a good understanding of what it is that we're looking for, what is available, not trying to put out an RFP for something that will never be produced and will never deliver. So we'll spend a lot of money on some vendor trying to do that. We don't do that anymore. We always baseline with an RFI, and that gives us a lot of opportunity for understanding.
Do you think, part of being decentralized is that it seems like it would make it difficult for somebody to intrude, and as you get more centralized, then are you concerned they'll make it easier for somebody because once they figure out exactly how to intrude in your system, they hit everybody at the same time? Do you have any concerns about that?
I am always concerned about that, sir. The balance between the ease of operation and the speed at which you can operate a very homogeneous network at large scale. So if everything is the same and you're able to automate the processes of changing that, then you can do that very rapidly. So operation and cybersecurity can be done very, very rapidly. But that same ability is also a potential weakness if an adversary is able to get in, because then they can do the same kind of things. So you have to balance that and understand where essentially your, I'm in the Navy, so your watertight doors are for, for watertight integrity. How do you block that so that that kind of adversary behavior isn't able to penetrate your entire network?
One of the things I've been advocating since joining is people, that's a great question. People always ask, are we better off being decentralized? And I always say, well, then you have 1,000 ways of which someone can get in. So that's the downside of that. If you centralize, then if someone can get in, the breadth of the surface space they can cause damage in is much larger. And I always say it comes down to how you architect for that centralized approach. If you architect with a very flat area where once they get in, they can cause great havoc, that's not appropriate. But if you're smartly architecting for a centralized approach where you're limiting what I like to call the blast radius, what the problem can be occurred, then actually centralization has some huge merits that you don't get, obviously, from the decentralized side.
Thank you. Let me just move on, and I'll have Senator Wicker. Senator Wicker?
Well, thank you very much. And it's too bad we've got so many balls in the air. We can't be here for the entire hearing. Has anyone asked you all about China and Huawei and ZTE and Chinese-owned information companies yet? Has anyone asked that in this hearing today?
Yes, sir. Earlier it was asked, and what we said was, yes, we understand the nature of the problems with those products. We have a good understanding of where they are and are not inside of our environment, and we said that if you would like to go deeper, given the sensitivity and the nature of what those products do, we'd be best to have that conversation in a closed hearing.
Yes, but let's see what we can talk about
Okay.
in an open setting like this. In terms of our national security strategy, new national security policy, is what is contained in there adequate to meet this challenge? How much of DoD's information flows over commercial networks, for example? And do we need to be concerned about that? Is there something going on now with commercial providers to improve cybersecurity of these information networks that involve crucial national security matters? Mr. Deasy.
Yeah, there's a couple there. There's a part on strategy, and I'll let General Crall take the strategy. To your point, you bring up a good point. If you think about how data moves across the Department of Defense, both CONUS and OCONUS, you have to ask yourself, where are you touching the commercial side of an environment, and how well do we understand the commercial nature of what products like Huawei's might be in there? We have a very good understanding for CONUS, what that looks like, and what those vulnerabilities are. For OCONUS, as you can imagine, it's a lot more complicated because those networks sit with providers outside the U.S. And so we have to architect and be a lot more thoughtful about how we set up on an OCONUS basis because of that.
If there are Huawei products, what's our concern?
The concern is that inside those products, there will be engineered solutions that allow them to capture information that can be sent back to the adversary.
And those solutions would already been engineered and already implanted in certain instances. Isn't that correct?
I cannot speak to the detailed engineers' designs of the Huawei products, but in theory, yes, if that product was engineered with back doors where it was exfiltrating, that would be the case.
So I'm concerned that capability may already be out there and installed in many places outside the continental United States, which is what you're saying when you say OCONUS. Mm-hmm. Now, General Crall, what would you like to add about that?
Sir, I realize the focus on outside CONUS, but I don't know that I would exclude inside CONUS.
Right.
To your point, a lot of the gear, when you talk about how we're talking about networks and service providers, and there's some level of granularity you can have in researching the flow of traffic and how they're handled. But there's also the smaller end, the peripherals, the switches, the routers, the hardware that allow these connections to take place. We understand what white gear is. These are the fact that you can't trust what's on a label. There's a concerted effort to ensure that what's marked is in fact what's inside. So to your point, you have concerns potentially that there could be challenges in making sure that the authenticity of the gear is what's stated, and that concern is shared. And in a closed session, sir, we'd be able to provide a little more detail on how we examine that.
Admiral, do you have anything to add?
Just that we have done an enumeration of that equipment, and so we do understand what is out there. And again, we can talk about the specifics in a closed hearing.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. And I'm told that Senator Gillibrand is next.
Senator Gillibrand.
Thank you so much. I want to ask a little bit about cybersecurity architecture, because I took from Senator Wicker's questions. He talked about ZTE and Huawei already. Forming a consistent and comprehensive cybersecurity architecture across the DoD and, frankly, across of all of government is vital to our national security. What roadblocks are currently in place that inhibits this from being a reality? And do you all feel that you have the necessary authorities to overcome those roadblocks?
I don't see roadblocks, I see legacy. That is probably our biggest challenge. So for years, we had this conversation earlier, we have allowed services and various components to roll and implement unique solutions that maybe aren't interoperable or stand alone. As I said earlier, with the new authorities that the DoD CIO office was granted starting this year, it now allows my office to establish the standards and the architectures that the components and the services have followed, which was why General Crall made the comment earlier that this is the year now where there will be a lot of noise in the system, because we are going to drive those standards, we're going to drive implementation, and we know there will be people that are going to be very uncomfortable about the fact that we're no longer going to allow them to stand up their own architectures or solutions.
Right. Either of you have anything to add?
Yes, ma'am. I'll just add that one of the difficulties of changing the architecture in the military is that we rely on these systems for ongoing missions every day.
Yep.
And so the time that it takes for finding time where you can take a system offline in order to make the upgrade ends up oftentimes being the long pole in the tent of actually changing the architecture, which is why we oftentimes have a lot of legacy. Funding can become a problem, but the time is actually the driver in most cases. And we have to, as we build out future architectures, we have to build in the ability to make those changes very rapidly on the fly without having, in some cases, weeks and even months of downtime for the systems for something like a ship or an airplane or a headquarters building.
Yep.
Ma'am, I used to think that starting things was the most difficult thing in the department. I've since learned that stopping them potentially is more difficult.
Welcome to the federal government.
So I think that really driving toward ensuring that while we have a plan to onboard new capabilities, we're smart in making sure that we can retire legacy where appropriate, because we end up in this position where it's simply not affordable to keep it all alive. And we've been a little slow on retiring legacy, but we have a plan under the new strategy and the lines of effort to get after that.
A section of the NDAA I helped craft directed the Secretary of Defense to enhance awareness of cybersecurity threats among small manufacturers and universities working on DoD programs. What actions have been undertaken to execute this order, and how successful do you believe these actions have been? And more to that point, a lot of the industrial base has led to an emphasis on bringing in more small businesses in the process, but meeting cybersecurity requirements is really hard for them. So related, what does the DoD do now to help those small businesses with cybersecurity so that they could participate in the future?
So as we had discussed earlier, that topic is actually part of our top 10 priorities. A couple dimensions of that. I'd actually say there's probably 3 dimensions. You mentioned the academia dimension of that. You mentioned the small business dimension of that. We definitely need to help figure out how we're going to handle small businesses. If you look at what it takes today to do good cyber hygienes, to stay ahead of the adversary, we know many of the second and third or fourth tier supply base simply doesn't have the wherewithal to do that. We have some thoughts underway about how we can bring them into, whether it's a cloud or an extension of our network, and we can fortify them with services that we provide. We are in the very early days of that, but you should know that we're in active conversations of how to do that. The other thing we're doing is, was discussed earlier, is we stood up a task force that reports directly to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and that task force is looking at the end-to-end way that our supply chain works, which includes the academic world around base research that's done, or maybe more classified work that's done on our behalf, and how do we really understand and get a better handle on how that research is done, where it's done, and what are the mechanisms that these institutions are using to ensure that things are being done in a safe, sound manner.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I have a quick question, and then we'll go back to Senator Wicker for our second round. As in any competition, you're always evaluating your opponent. As we evaluate in the cyber technology realm, if you will, our opponents, how do you rate our opponents, China and Russia, where they are today, where we are today, and their opportunity basically either to stay ahead, pull ahead, or you feel comfortable the direction we're going that we can basically offset the advancements they've made in such a quick period of time? So we can start General Crall and just come right across.
Yes, sir. I think I'd have difficulty answering that in open forum. I would say this, though, just to characterize your question, is that we are, you never rest, as you know, on any capability or laurels that we have. We know what we know, but there's also a concern about what we don't know. And we have a lot of suspicions on where our peer and near-peer competitors
if you're
are.
identifying your two competitors, your two of your most challenging competitors, I guess it would, we've said this in open meetings before, I mean, it's going to be China and Russia, correct?
There's no doubt, sir, that they are at the top of our priorities. Okay. And when you look at their capabilities, they are increasing, as are ours, and which is why it requires great vigilance.
I think Senator. No, go ahead if you're going to.
Yeah, I'm just going to.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Mr. Deasy.
So, to the General's point, difficult in this setting to answer some aspects of that. I will tell you that I have a weekly session where I am briefed by U.S. Cyber Command and NSA, and we specifically are briefed on China and Russia. And one of the reasons I wanted to get into this normal cycle of doing these briefings, which is the very point that I think you're trying to poke at, is trying to understand vis-a-vis where we are on our offensive as well as defensive capability. And suffice to say that these are very strong, capable adversaries, but at the same time, we have some strong, capable abilities ourselves.
Admiral?
Yes, sir. I will echo their comments about specifics in terms of capabilities against our adversaries. It would be better in a closed session, but I will say that China and Russia both have very clearly exercised and demonstrated their not just ability but willingness to fight in this domain, and we see that every day. And regardless of the adversary, we see the concerted effort to attack the United States and the Department of Defense.
Acting Director Shanahan, is he committed to implementation of the new cyber strategy?
Absolutely. One of the things I said in my opening remarks that I should really stress is when I came on board, one of the things that he wanted to establish was a weekly cadence for CIO Cyber. We call it the CIO Cyber Working Group. He personally, before his new duties came into play, chaired that meeting. He was at it every week. He would look for the metrics. He would be quite the tasker of ensuring the activities were getting done. And he's done a very strong handoff to now presuming the duties of the Deputy Secretary Norquist, who is now continuing that. So you should know that one of the things I have been incredibly pleased since joining the department is to see the top of the house be extremely active on a what I'll call a very frequent basis, i.e. weekly, in the engagement of all the activity that you heard us talk about today.
Senator Wicker.
Well, that's good to know. And it's encouraging, and I'm sure it's encouraging to Senator Manchin, too. My last question deals with data rights and data control policies, getting the best technology but at an affordable price. You got a company there with good technology. They're profit-oriented. They don't have to make a deal with anybody. They're under no special obligation to do business with the government. So how are we doing with regard to our policy there? Does it deter cutting-edge cybersecurity companies from doing business with the Pentagon? Is it difficult to strike a balance between getting the best and getting something we can afford? And what's your assessment of the Department's data rights and data control policies?
Yes, sir. I'd certainly tell you there's a focus, and you bring up a couple issues when it comes to rights. I think the verdict is still out, by the way, on who owns data. Lawyers will tell you when you go through this understanding of where it's housed, how it's moved, what residual components of data reside. We care, we're concerned, and we have policies in place on where we put that data in the Department of Defense. What I think to your comment about the struggle between affordability and really doing business with the best customers are always the desired customers, it would not be truthful for me to tell you that in every instance we get the best of both worlds. Again, because of some ways that we acquire services, we often or at times have gone with what is the most expedient or those we could do business with based on rules and regulations. So we're still finding our way through that in some cases. But the real focus, I think, for the Department when it comes to policy and implementation on the strategy is really how we start focusing on data and data security at rest and in transit. Maybe less with how it's stored or transported in conventional ways, but more accurately now is how do we safeguard it in all aspects of it at rest and in movement.
Are you able to be specific about rules and regulations that you referred to? What would be an example?
Sir, I would like to come back to you in writing on rules and regulations to be specific, but the idea, for example, if we wanted to host data in a commercial cloud today, and let's say that data was unclassified data, there's a reason why we tend to put this data repository under certain controls like federal ramp, conditions on storage and security, but also on premises. I can just answer for the Marine Corps that when I was the CIO prior to this job, I personally felt uncomfortable in some business arrangements of putting my data in a commercial cloud where I could not guarantee that if I stopped doing business with that company, of what it meant to return the data to me. It's electronic. I didn't know what I would get back. So a very specific example, personally.
You didn't know if you'd get it all back.
That's correct, sir. So I ended up storing that data on-prem where I could control it, and I asked for services to push that data through those commercial contractors, but things have changed since then. There are some safeguards that are out there that make doing business that way maybe a little better when it comes to encryption, which is what I was getting after, meaning I might be able to house that data under certain rights where I hold the keys to that encryption and feel more secure about where it resides.
Okay, well, you're going to get back to me with a supplemental answer for the record.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service and for being here today. In an annual assessment of cyber threats reported by Bloomberg News, you may have seen that report, the DoD's Operational Test and Evaluation Office, according to that report, found that the department has not fully grasped how to counter new threats posed by emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. Mr. Deasy, the CIO position, has served as a principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense for a breadth of issues beyond cybersecurity, including information technologies, communications networks, and the like, command systems. In your prepared remarks, you cite a number of emerging technologies that DoD has identified for potential use, such as software-defined networks. I know that Senator Rounds asked you some questions on this topic. You also noted that DoD has evaluated machine learning, artificial intelligence systems that are working to integrate these capabilities and networks. So for you and maybe for all the witnesses, what are the artificial systems currently useful at DoD, and what's holding DoD back elsewhere? Is it in-house expertise, technical resources, state of the field, and maybe you could comment on the Bloomberg report as well.
So work very close with the DOT&E, very much aware of that report. It's quite interesting when you go through the observations in that report. They point out things like leadership responsiveness, finding hygiene problems. They point out things like nuclear command and control in the age and the indeserviceable life of equipment. They talk about stolen credentials, breaches of defense contractors. The Top 10 program that we have been referring to throughout the testimony today was actually created, as I said earlier, to look at holistically where are all the intervention points that adversaries can touch us, and how do we address that. So I'm pleased that when I look at this report, that many of the things that are sitting inside of the top 10 stuff that we're starting to implement actually mirrors very nicely the report. The other thing inside that report, on the very end of that report, it makes observations about where they see improvements. And one of the things that they point out clearly in there is that they now believe the Department of Defense is scoping the task properly. They believe there is a follow-up, there is an organizational construct in place across the Department of Defense to address these problems, and that we now know what are the tools and the skill sets that we have to put in place to get after it. So that's kind of part A to your question. To the part around the other activities, may it be artificial intelligence, the use of cloud, the use of next-generation command and controls. As I stressed earlier, when I talk about the digital modernization of the Department of Defense, I always like to remind people that this is a highly integrated set of things that we're doing. I always start off by saying there is no doubt that AI and what it offers the department is going to be quite significant. How we implement that is going to require that we put in a robust enterprise cloud. How we secure that cloud, how we use commercial providers to put the AI on top of that is very important. However, if we don't solve for next-generation command and control communications, we will not get the necessary information out to the warfighter. So you must look at cyber from a communication standpoint, a satellite standpoint as well. So all of these things to me are tightly integrated, and that's why when we talk about the digital modernization program with the Department of Defense, cyber has to sit at the forefront of everything that we do, sir.
Do you have any comment?
Yes, sir. I'd like to say a couple of things. One of the things that they talk about in that report is the importance of understanding the cyber terrain and starting to really grasp that. That has been a major effort of the Joint Force Headquarters DODN. We actually put out an order that specifically lays that out for the 43 DoD components to identify, map their cyber terrain, map what is key cyber terrain so that we can recognize where additional forces need to be put, where additional emphasis might need to be to include putting some of our cyber protection teams on that key cyber terrain. And in my opening comments, I mentioned that I am responsible for the command readiness inspections, that we have changed from just a readiness inspection of a checklist of configuration to an operational readiness inspection that takes that operational evaluation is going to that command to understand, do they understand what their key cyber terrain is relevant to their mission, specific to their mission, and therefore, do they know how to protect their mission by protecting that key cyber terrain? Those are the kinds of things that DOT&E has recognized that are really critical for us to move forward and to not have to expand resources tremendously to protect everything equally, but to focus our resources on the things that are most important in the DoD.
Thank you.
So, sir, I find it interesting that we answered that question a little bit based on some of our portfolio experience and where we sit. So Mr. Deasy talks about, scoping the problem set, which is in the report. Admiral Norton talks about knowing your terrain. A third in that top three of what they talked about the department may be doing fairly well at, or at least at the cusp of, is unity of effort. So one of the areas that...
Unity of effort.
Yes, sir. The idea that finally pulling together, Mr. Deasy has talked about not going our own ways or allowing, these niche solutions that don't really work well together. So as one of the implementers of that strategy, we have a strategy that we can execute. We have very clear goals and guidelines and really looking to ensure that we do this smartly. That we come together to solve that problem. So I think those three answers really fit well in the top three that came out of the findings in that report.
Was lack of unity of effort a problem, do you think?
I think it has been a problem, sir, to be fair. I think that we've turned a corner on that even well-intentioned people doing business in opposite directions really puts us in a fix, for example, of simply putting requirements out on a table and allowing them to be solved in any way, shape, or form sometimes means to get those solutions to work together as the government needs it to do, especially DoD. You might have more money in emulation and more engineering problems in getting things to fit that are dissimilar than you would if you had a common solution going forward. So yes, I think it's a fair criticism of past performance, but I'd like to say that I think we're on a different track, and I'm pretty optimistic that we can pull together.
Thank you. Thank you all.
I'd like to follow up just one step further, and I'm going to go to Vice Admiral Norton with this. Today, the Department's cybersecurity architecture appears to be fairly decentralized. With, in this particular case, JFHQ DODN possessing what I think would be only limited visibility into its components, networks, and endpoints. Is this, number one, is my premise correct? I think it is. Second of all, if it is, then is this because of a policy decision that needs to be changed? Is it a capacity issue on behalf of JFHQ DODN? Or is it a technical problem? And does JFHQ DODN need additional resources or authorities to be more effective?
Well, first, it was definitely not a policy decision to decentralize the data. Remember, I said that Joint Force Headquarters DODN has only been in existence for 4 years. We just reached full operational capability a year ago this week. So all of those networks that Senator Manchin talked about, those 1,000 networks, they all grew up with their own ability to look at their own network independently. And over time, we're starting to aggregate that in a way that does centralize the ability to view that. Over the last year, Joint Force Headquarters Doden has made tremendous progress in gaining visibility on all of those networks across the DoD. And certainly at the Tier 1 level, at the Internet access points and at the endpoints, and helping to aggregate, as General Crall said, in some cases, in difficult ways, because the technology doesn't necessarily make that easy because they all acquired those in different ways. But bringing that data together in a way that gives us at Joint Force Headquarters Doden a much better understanding of what everybody's cyber posture is across all of those networks. We're certainly not perfect. It's certainly not in a manner that is technically easy and quick based on the disparate kinds of
Specific resource needs?
So an architecture that allows for the kind of standardization that Mr. Deasy is working on, and the policy that requires more standardization that General Crall has talked about. So those are already in work. I have the authority as under that directive authority for cyberspace operations, and have used that to great extent to be able to get that data and start to give that visibility to both my forces and to U.S. Cyber Command.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Manchin.
Just one follow-up there. I think for Mr. Deasy and General Crall, I understand there's a so-called cross-functional team and composed of a small number of experts from across the department, which works, I think, with both of you all. So I guess I would ask, Congress created this cross-functional team. Sometimes we're not always spot on, to say the least. I want to know if you all agree with this team, and is it functioning well, or is there things we can do to help?
So I'll start with that, and much of the work is actually led by General Crall. I think we actually have, for the first time, a series of things that are going on that are well. You have a secretary and a deputy, as I mentioned earlier, that are highly actively engaged in this topic, so you need the top of the house to be highly engaged on this. B, you have a set of leaders that are very impatient, including myself, that are done admiring the problem and are moving into tasking. This is including being less tolerable on people being able to go off and use their own solutions. The authorities that you all gave me starting this year around being able to set architectural standards is quite significant. We are now starting to use those new authorities. And then finally, you use the term, cross, a team that's been brought together. That, in my opinion, is probably the biggest thing that has helped us, is empowering General Crall by giving him a set of experts that cut across the department that are actually helping him now to drive those solutions.
Sir, Congress got that right. The cross-functional team works, and it has several advantages. It's only as good as it's paid attention to. There are probably examples of some cross-functional teams maybe not producing, but the cross-functional team that's involved under the PCA is well-resourced in the sense that we've got the right people. The participating agencies that provide representation in the workforce sent us their best. So I'll start with that. We've got good people. The second piece is we can approach problems in ways that don't have some of the biases. We don't have any stake in the fight or any legacy that we hold on to. It really is about the mission. So we normally come to the table with an advantage in solving some of those problems. So it's been instrumental in moving the strategy into implementation.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, I want to take this opportunity to thank our members and Senator Manchin for participating today. This has been very helpful to us. I'd like to thank our witnesses today for their participation. There were several questions that you indicated you would prefer to answer in a classified setting. I would ask that you provide us with those answers. Committee staff has indicated that you may bring those in at the level of SCI in your responses. We would expect you'd be able to do that in the next couple of weeks, okay? With that, I want to thank everyone for participating, and this subcommittee meeting is adjourned.